Hi, Alex.
Hello, Herine, hello. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm good too, thank you. So thank you for joining in for this meeting. This is one of the experience exchange meetings today we have. I'm really glad to see you online, but still to see you. And you are a exceptional person because you represent two countries at once, both Kenya and Rwanda. And I actually wanted to make it maybe a little bit more introductional to the community because most of the people they can't imagine what's going on in Africa and how the situation with education and Olympiads looks like there. So maybe today we will be talking a little bit more of how is it, what's going on, and how do you manage to deal with those issues. Hopefully, it will be helpful for others to also find solutions, maybe learn from your example, or maybe someone will be able to provide some assistance in any issues and questions that you will ask. So could you please tell us the story, how you joined in? How did you start the Olympiad, and what issues did you encounter?
So first of all, thank you for creating time to have a discussion with me. I know I'm perhaps one of the newest persons in the IEO family, so having this conversation, I think, is a special gesture. If you remember, the first time we interacted was February this year, and it was based on a recommendation from a dear friend from Nigeria, Professor Solarin. And I would say we would not be here discussing the milestones that we achieved without Professor Solarin, but I'll come back to that. So I think the background of meeting IEO for the first time, especially based on that recommendation, goes back to some work that I've done before. So as I may have already intimated too, I'm Kenyan by nationality, but I've been living in Rwanda for the last 6 years. And I've been working in the education space. And one of my last projects that I really helped, I would say, spearhead and start off was a massive teacher training program in Rwanda, which was being done in partnership with the Ministry of Education here. It was targeting 800 secondary schools, over 5,000 teachers, and hundreds of thousands of students. Wow. And the program was a teacher training program, as I've already said, but when I picked up that project as the first director of the program, I very quickly put in activities that targeted students in form of competitions. So in addition to training the teachers, I started off competitions that would be more collaborative, done within the school on one end, but we also, with the support of other people, jumped into the conversation around Mathematics Olympiad. So Rwanda by 2018 had not participated in the Mathematics Olympiad. But working together with a few people who were very interested, some of them former Maths Olympiads, and the program that I was leading, which provided a very unique avenue into the schools and accessing the students, we were able to begin that process. And I remember in 2019, I visited South Africa to observe the Olympiad, the Pan-African Mathematics Olympiad. And soon after, I remember inviting the whole Pan-African leadership team to Rwanda for I would say it was almost like the official launch of our Olympiad journey for mathematics. Anyway, long story short, Rwanda now is one of the very active participants in Mathematics Olympiad. I think just this year, there was a lot of excitement in the country to the extent that they were hosted by the president of the country because the team this year won their first gold medal at the Pan-African Mathematics Olympiad. So there was a whole buzz and conversation around that. And I was looking at it, I was very humble because I could remember the start when we were just meeting and discussing. And this is important. First of all, why am I drawn to competitions? Because this will inform how I discuss how we went about this. I'm drawn to competitions not just for the sake of competitions. In fact, when I do my presentations to schools, I do not jump straight into the economic Olympiads. I spend time to discuss why competitions, what is the value, what value does competitions, academic competitions, bring to the development of students. Now, it so happens that my PhD was on learners. So my PhD was in mathematics education, was on self-regulated learning. And more importantly, just looking broadly at how we can make learners more skillful, how we can deliberately create an environment to build, explicitly build key dispositions like persistence and resilience. So I see competitions as a very important entry point into shaping and nurturing the kind of learners that we need, not just in our education spaces, but post our education spaces, because skills like lifelong learning, skills like being adaptive and being resilient are things, problem solving, we need that beyond school. So for me, that's why I always say, if I have 10 Rwandan francs, if I may use that, I would spend 6 Rwandan francs on the teacher and make sure I spend 4 Rwandan francs on the students. And one of those things about the students would likely be a competition, because it provides both an opportunity for extrinsic motivation, but if managed well, also intrinsic motivation. So the success with running the Maths Olympiad, I believe that is part of how I interacted with Professor Herine, who is the one championing the economic Olympiads in Nigeria. He is part of the Pan-African Mathematics Olympiad leadership. He had interacted with me in all these forums, and I believe that's how he may have introduced, told you about Dr. Herine in Rwanda. But the other thing, just to finish in answering your question, is that as a person, I'm based in Rwanda, yes. I always say I'm Kenyan born, but I'm African at heart. So a lot of the activities that I do are about how do I contribute to the education agenda? How do we build interventions? Some of them international like these ones, but make sure we do them in a way that is responsive to our context, needs, and aspirations. So I was very excited when you reached out to me and had this conversation with me, because again, I thrive in challenges. So it was a challenging task and I ran with it.
No, I'm so glad that you mentioned Professor Adwal. He is an amazing person as well. Hopefully, we will have some kind of same meeting with him soon enough. I think he also is a priest and does a lot for his community. From his stories, I have heard a lot of unsettling things about the education. And you mentioned that the context and the means you seek for any education for African students might differ, might really differ from what we are acquainted with. So could you please tell us a bit more of this context? Like, what is the education like for the students in your country? Do they have the ordinary schools enough for them? Do they have the language courses? Do they have the economics in it? And if they do, what is the program? And what are the difficulties that maybe I cannot even imagine that you are facing?
So Africa is it's such a big continent. There's quite a lot of variations across the countries, but there are also similarities. And there's always great opportunity to learn and to draw lessons from each other, because yes, there are certain aspects about our context that may be similar. So most of the time we have the public education system, which is run and I would say overseen and funded through the government. But in a number of countries, we also have a growing population of private schools, which tend to either offer still the national curriculum or offer the different international curriculum, whether the Cambridge education system or other international curriculum. I would say that over time, our education curriculum varied, and largely it would be mostly due to who was the colonial quote unquote master in them days. So you'll find that most countries have their national curriculum originally fashioned around what the colonial masters' education systems were, sometimes though not with the evolution that has happened in those countries that specifically they were affiliated to. So I'll try and give an example. I do stuff across the continent, but let me just focus on the two countries, Rwanda and Kenya. I grew up in Kenya. I went to school in Kenya. Their public primary and secondary schools, there's a growing population of private schools. Both of them, I would say, depending, I wouldn't say that the private schools do better than public schools necessarily. It depends. But yes, there are some opportunities. If I think about the public schools, they are more accessible. They are normally less costly to the parent. In most cases, there are some resources that are provided by the government, and therefore perhaps there are even more stricter quality assurance mechanisms in place. So those are some advantages of public schools, whether primary or secondary, but in this case, we're talking about secondary. The challenges, though, actually, it's very interesting because in Kenya, when you get, so we for a long time, we had this education system that was 8-4-4, 8 years in primary school, 4 years in secondary school, and then 4 years in university. I'm saying for a long time because they have just recently changed that. And in that system, which is what I would say I went through and has been there for ages, maybe for 30 years now. Primary school, the exam at the end of each level, at the end of primary school is very high stakes. So when you get to the 8th year in your primary school, you do a very high stakes exam. And it's considered high stakes because it determines which secondary school you are admitted to. And yet the secondary schools are of different tiers. They are schools within the public system that I would say are very affluent, very resourced, good infrastructure, and almost there's an assurance that if you end up in that school, you're almost sure of doing very well at secondary school, again, in a very high stakes exam at the end of 4 years that is supposed to lead you to be admitted to the university. So what you'll find in Kenya, and I'll soon swing to Rwanda, is that there are many private schools at primary level, and many parents a good chunk of the middle class parents would try and get their kids into the private primary schools so that they can do well at the end of the primary exams, so that they can access the good public secondary schools. So you take your child into private so that you can compete well and go into a good public secondary schools. So secondary-wise in Kenya, the public schools are still, I would say, most cases, more popular than the private schools. What are some of the challenges? As you may have already heard, it could be things to do with class population. You can have a class as many as 50, 60, 70, maybe sometimes 80 if it's lower classes. This varies again whether you are in the rural population or you are in the urban population. And then there'll be other factors, the distance from schools, kids walking maybe an hour to get to school or an hour or two on foot. There'll be other factors. I mean, obviously things happening at home affect the student's learning. So is the student eating at home? Or do they come to school hungry? So some students will face some of those challenges, but the governments have over the years tried to put in mechanisms to address that. When you come to Rwanda, it's slightly different. They were colonized by French country, so their system was more of 7-6-3, so 7 years in, right now actually 6 years in primary school, and then they have 7 years in secondary school and 4 years in university. Rwanda is different, but the program they have now, many countries are going are swinging to that. And so at the end of primary school, you go into secondary school. Again, there are different tiers of public schools, very perhaps more affluent, but maybe just 10%. And then the rest, less infrastructure. Again, similar challenges, as most of them are day schools in Rwanda. So it means students walk home every day. In Kenya, many of the secondary schools are boarding schools. And that brought in a bit of different dynamics when we were organizing for the competitions. So again, large classrooms, perhaps less resourced infrastructure. For example, we're living in the ICT age. I would say Rwanda is doing much better in terms of having laptops in schools compared to Kenya. But perhaps in terms of the student population ratio is still, you could have 1,000 students and you have 20 laptops. So it's still fairly minimal. So yeah, those are some of the realities around your education.
Do you have support of the government, of the ordinary public schools, in inviting students to the national competitions? Are they able to participate? Do they help you to promote it?
As you may have seen, in my application last year, my intention for both countries was initially, first and foremost, to work with the private schools and then swing into public schools. And the reason is the turnaround time was very short. We met in February. We needed a team by August. Normally, involving government can take as long as 2 years before they buy into the concept, before they really give the permission for the students to participate. And sometimes for them to buy into the concept, they want to see some results. They want to see something that is already going on and give it, maybe during when you're hosting that, you invite them into some of the sessions, they get a sense of the experience, and then you build a case for bringing the public schools on board. That's one angle. So do they allow students to participate in some of these national competitions? Yes, they do. I mean, the Olympiad that we did for mathematics has largely been actually students from the public schools. But the reason was that it was riding off a project that was already existing and that had partnership with the government from the word go. Now, when you're starting something as new as the Economic Olympiad, there is value in building something, at least for 1 or 2 years, make a story and narrative around it. During those sessions, invite and involve the government officers, maybe invite them to an event or just send informational material, which is what we started doing. And then there's always a lot of, what do they say, bureaucracy, but it plays out differently. So in Kenya, actually, we ended up having public schools participating. We had 2 public schools and 1 private school participate. But in terms of the community that we mobilized between April and August, a majority of those that we mobilized were public schools. But so it plays out differently because some in Kenya, for example, the schools have autonomy. They can decide they're participating in an activity. And then maybe at the point of international travel, that's when you have to bring in the Ministry of Education and say, okay, these kids need to travel internationally. They will be traveling with teacher AB. And so at that point, you bring on board the Ministry of Education. And from the experience with Kenya, this is Kenya, from the experience of Math Olympiad in the Kenyan context, they did that for almost 4 years before the Ministry of Education now came on board to officially identify themselves with the activity. So different dynamics. In Rwanda, because I've worked here for a long time, I've worked closely with the Ministry of Education. They have statutory bodies that you'd be engaging with. So for example, Rwanda, it will be the body in charge of assessment. They have a national assessment and examination body. Based on the work that I've done with them before the Olympiads, the teacher training, what I did is that I was able to, write to the Director General and tell them, this is something that we are doing. And for them to acknowledge that, yes, they are informed and they will be keen to, attend some of our sessions, and then maybe a turnaround time of two Olympiads, they can then officially bring the public schools on board. But there is a challenge. The challenge with is the now who takes care of the costs around the competitions. You, for example, if it's public schools, I mean, the numbers are good. Like there was a time we were doing for the Maths Olympiad, where I was leading something also with the University of Waterloo, and we could get up to 200,000 students participate in the competition. Wow. Because we had this network of teachers, and each of the teachers was a gateway into their classroom. But there are costs to it. One, you have to print the papers, the exams to take them there. Remember, we said the IT infrastructure is very minimal. So it means you have to print the tests. You have to transport the tests across the country. You have to facilitate or give some supportive stipend to the teacher that is going to oversee the students sitting in. And then we had to bring all these papers at central points and bring teachers to help mark these papers across one weekend. The beautiful thing then is that I was working with these 5,000 teachers, and because all these things, the economic Olympiads, the Math Olympiad, they're actually avenues for teacher training, because they're avenues for discussing quality of assessments, the different kinds of assessment questions. So we would use them as an entry for teacher training within the teacher training program. And so it meant the resources that was there for the teacher training, because that was a donor-funded program, we could tap into those resources to facilitate something like that. And also University of Waterloo was able to invest some resources into it. So the big catch that comes with having the public schools on board is that in most cases, especially for Rwanda, it's different from Kenya. For Rwanda, it is almost not acceptable to have students contribute any money to such an activity. And in that case, therefore, yet you are definitely going to spend money. So you have to really say, where am I going to get these resources? Now, on the other side, the advantage that is there in Rwanda is that one, they have a number of development partners doing different activities in the education sector. So the challenge is over time to see which of the development partners would find this really falling within some of the things they're trying to achieve. That's number one. Number two, there's also opportunity to bring the corporate sector on board. But it takes, I've done activities where I've rallied the corporate sectors to come on board and sponsor some of these things. But it takes a bit of conversation. I remember, for example, hosting the international last year, this year, the Economic Olympiads. I realized very late that we needed the kind of infrastructure we needed. So a day before registration was to close, my students, all of whom were private school students, so they had laptops and all that. But a day before the registration closed, somehow everybody had a problem with their laptop. Something was not going on properly with their laptop. And I realized that if we're going to rely on their tools and my space, then maybe it was not going to work. So what did I have to do? I reached out to a university, one of the private universities that I had contact with, and I'd already had some conversation with them about the Economics Olympiad. And I reached out to them and they said, oh, can you come and talk to the Vice Chancellor now? So I had to very quickly get into the car and run to the university and go before the Vice Chancellor and make a presentation, because it's like, why is this important? Why should we be part of this as a university? And make a presentation to the Vice Chancellor and say, this is why it is important. This is how it actually fits with your vision. And so what we need from you is space, designated space for these students to do to sit for the International Economic Olympiad exams. They will need computers, they will need cameras. And because one, I'd already had a conversation with somebody in the university, I had a contact. The ICT director was a former colleague. I think it was easy to run things around. That evening, they bought stuff. There are things they didn't have as a university, but they were so committed. They went and bought the cameras, they set up the space, and they said, okay, bring the students. They'll have a space designated for them for the days of the competition. So networks and contacts are really critical in making some of these things happen. Because otherwise resources, I know, for example, the Math Olympiads has been around for the last 60 years. the Pan-African Maths Olympiads. The last one I attended in Morocco, only about 15 African countries were participating. And if you talk to them, a lot of it was resources. How do we get the resources to run this and to get students to the international competitions?
You mentioned that the connections are crucial. Could you tell a little bit more of where do you work now and what kind of this kind of resources of connections are provided by this position that you have? And how did you search for other opportunities? Because sometimes the Olympiads in the countries are started even by the students, or by the teachers in the schools. So for them, it might be very interesting and important to hear this part of the story as well.
Yeah, so right now I run my organization called EduHub Afrique. It's my interest, as I pointed out, is shaping education interventions, but also research that are addressing issues within the continent. I'm very keen about, one of the things I found exciting about the IEO challenge was the opportunity to do both countries, because I didn't see them as individual disparate countries, but I also saw it as an opportunity to create a bridge between those countries. So as we speak, I haven't mentioned this, we are actually, when we planned our economics Olympiad, we also planned one for Rwanda, Kenya. So we hope to host a Rwanda, Kenya one this year in November. So, so from my organization and looking back to some of the other things I've done, I identify myself as a Pan-African educationist. I do a lot of communication stuff, or rather talking about education in the continent. For some years, I ran a podcast, which was called EduTalk Afrique Radio, which really allowed me to interact with a lot of educationists from across the continent. But on one hand, I think one of the things that uniquely I identify with as an educationist is that I am an educationist, but I sit at the intersection of education and practice. I really thrive in interfacing with different sectors. So in Rwanda, when we were starting this off, I had the advantage, as I said, of having worked in this space, having the reputation of having championed the economic, the Maths Olympiads. But more importantly, also just being somebody who could speak about this beyond the competition and tease out the importance and what it brings in developing the land. So it was not just, oh, you're going to go for competition, or you might go somewhere, but it was, what are these things that it really will build in the student, and how does this ripple back into what is happening in the classroom and post-classroom? So in terms of contacts, therefore, I had contacts with teachers within the Rwandan space. I'd been out of Kenya for almost 5 years, as I mentioned, but I've kept my contacts quite alive. So through platforms like school alumni, like I remember one of the ways I got some of the schools that I had interacted with was back home in Kenya. We have alumni associations back from the university, and a good proportion of my alumni members, the people I was with in university, are teachers. So I just beamed that out in the platform and said, I am organizing this. I need contacts with schools. And so I was given contacts with schools. I would pick up and say, so-and-so referred me to you. And, and Africa is very relational. We have a very relational culture. So you reaching out to me and telling me that Alex referred me to you and Alex is my friend, I will definitely give you an audience. And within that space, there were educationists, there are people in the corporate sector. So there are people I reached out, said, look, I'm also trying to get people in the corporate sector to listen to me. If you may have seen, we have a website now, we have a technical advisory team, and we actually kind of looked at the IEO and tried to mirror a little bit the structure, the leadership structure. So you'll see that I'm there, and then there is a patron. And the patron, I strategically picked somebody who is in the corporate sector, but who is in the space of economics and finance, and for a number of reasons. And one of them, immediate term and long term, is fundraising. And then there was a technical advisory team, which was made up of more people who were academicians. And actually, almost 3 of them are my former classmates at university or former year mates. And then I had the corporate advisors. Again, some of them are young people that I've mentored over time because I've lectured at the university before. I've run leadership programs, especially in Kenya. So some of these people now are holding some very defining positions in the corporate sector. So again, based on those past experiences, I would reach out to them. But the other thing I think that was important is very sustained conversation. As soon as I got a few of these contacts in the schools, we created a WhatsApp group. I had meetings with them, online meetings like this ones. I explained what this is about. It resonated with most of them, and they started calling each other, like snowballing. So I almost identified one of them as the lead coordinator. And you say, oh, we have this other school, and we have this other school, and we have this other school. So they kept inviting each other into the group. And then I kept hosting meetings. I think I hosted like 5, 6 meetings, just repeating the same thing. But whenever a group came in, I would take time to explain to them what we're doing and why we're doing them. And in Rwanda, because I'm here more often, I even invited the teachers physically. After a number of 2 online meetings, I invited them physically to our office, and we had a conversation together and talked about some of these things. So I think conversations is at the heart of making anything happen in the continent. We are lucky that nowadays we have the WhatsApp, especially. WhatsApp is like an engine driver for a lot of stuff here, because you're able to create communities, you're able to share success stories from one point to another. So when one school succeeds in recruiting students, and that is beamed to other schools, and then they feel, oh, inspired and all that. So just that continuous conversation, I think, was really important. And that's how I even got to get the universities in Kenya. I think we signed an MOU with one of the universities. Again, the DVC there was my former classmate, so it was not too hard to begin the conversation. So I think for me, I would say conversations are really important, but collaborations are also important within and across. So let's bring in Professor Ajewale into this conversation. Throughout that Pride, because there was such short time, and I must say, we didn't even get time to immerse ourselves into the technical stuff of the Economics Olympiad. There was no time, because a lot of the time was spent on mobilization. The only reason why we were able to make things happen is because Professor Solarine took that burden away from me. All the tests that we did were put together by the Nigerian team. They would put together, because they have their question banks and everything. So when we're having rounds of competition, I would just say I'm having a competition on this day, and Professor Solarine would generate the exams, and it was such that the exam can mark itself. He would post back the results to me. I would do the analysis. I would only collect qualitative feedback from the students. And so that really helped throughout until our selection process. All the exams were and support tools for marking the exams came from Nigeria. So I think that cross-country collaboration was also very, very critical in just knowing I have somebody who has been around longer and who is there and is ready to support. That really helped us achieve what we achieved within such a short time.
Oh yeah, that's always great to have a more experienced colleague who could help you to go through the hardships of the organizational processes and of the documentation that we have. Do you have any kind of benefits like scholarships for students who win in the National Olympiads, or do the universities somehow support this activity?
I would say that it's still too early to, as I said, given that this was the first engagement, there's a lot of people sitting, watching and wanting to be part of, wanting to see how this evolves. And I think potentially 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, there should be possibilities of this as we build this and farm up collaborations with universities. So in terms of scholarships, perhaps no. So far, no. I think the one that we saw was the one that came after the IEO, the one that was offered by the university from Russia. I think there was a communication on that basis. But having said that, extrinsic motivation, having something that the students are looking forward to getting at the end of the competition is really critical. Most of the students will not be drawn to it. I will tell you for sure that initially we were very hopeful, we'll get as many students to register, and then hopefully from the registration fee, we could get, secure the tickets for the students to come for the International Economic Olympiads. We didn't have a quarter of the students that we expected. The schools were very willing, but the challenge we had was we started too late. And for most of the international schools, it was their last term of the academic year. So there were a lot of things already in the calendar. So as a result, of course, we did mobilize funding, because for you to run something like this, it has to be self-sustaining. And so you have to think about how to get the sponsors on board and how to just make things work in between. So anyway, I was just saying this to say our students were therefore very disappointed when they realized they could not travel to, because for some of them, that was the first attractor point. Oh, if I get into this, I might actually win and be part of the national team, and then I might actually travel internationally. Now, when that didn't happen, it dampened a lot of the students' spirits. In fact, in some cases, some of them had to remind them still the value of participating, even if they were not there physically. So, but for Kenya, we promised them, because we were going to have the Rwanda-Kenya competition. So we actually are buying tickets for the national team from Kenya, to travel into Rwanda for the Rwanda-Kenya competition. So I'm just saying that to say that, and this is now based on personal investments, really. And truth be told, in the first year, those of us, I had to invest my personal money, a lot of my personal money in this whole process, because some of the things didn't work out as exactly the way we thought they would work out. And yet we had already, made commitments and promises. So there was no way you're turning back. At least we had to come to some middle ground to that. So yeah, extrinsic motivation is really important.
But is it a common practice for universities to provide some additional motivation to the students that do perform good?
Yes, over time it does. It could. It might not be like in Kenya. The university we are partnering with is one of the top private universities in Kenya. I think one has the highest reputation in terms of the courses it does. And depending over time, I think that there are competitions over time that sometimes have given either access to some of their short professional courses or things like that. But yeah, it takes a bit of relationship building and running of it for some time before one can achieve that.
So do you have some plans, some ideas on the possible growth of the competition? What were the numbers of participation? What was the participation rate for this year? And what would you estimate to be for the next year?
So in Kenya, we had, even though we mobilized almost up to 100 schools on our WhatsApp platform, and there was much interest, we ended up just having 3 of the schools coming for the competition. And as I said, the main challenge was the time. We had too short turnaround time for the competition, because most of the schools put in activities there in their calendar quite early. And there are also some statutory activities that happen when there's national exams and all that. So the most important thing is to start early. And that's why we are starting as early as now to begin talking about next year's competition. that's the most important thing. To start early, to get the schools aware of the competition. I think this year it's easier because we are not starting from ground zero, introducing yourself, introducing what is economic Olympiads and all that. Having had the team to participate, it's easier to talk about it. It's easier, there's more interest. And so for me, that's the main thing. Start early, get the schools talking about this early. Begin identifying the students, because that's the other thing we missed out on. We missed out on opportunity to train our students because of the very short turnaround time. So this year, for example, the plan is to ensure that by April, we have maybe the top 20 students from each of the countries, so that hopefully in April they can go for a training camp in each of the students, normally 20 to 30 students. And then at the end of the training camp, select maybe the top 10 students, sustain trainings for these students. And then maybe by June, now identify who are the 5 students that are going to represent the country. The challenge, again, we had for Economic Olympiads in this season was the resources. Apart from the syllabus outline that was given to us, in Kenya, for example, economics as a subject is the numbers of the schools doing economics as a subject at secondary school level has been decreasing over time. So it's not something that 80% of the students get exposure to. So it meant that the students who are coming on board, they were not necessarily doing economics, but they had to engage with the curriculum, which some of them might have found a little too new and challenging to engage with within such a short time. So if you remember last year, one of the strategies one of the things we did, which didn't work out fully, but which we expect to refine this year, is that we brought university students together, and they did some of the economics competition questions. And then we asked them to develop resources for specific topics within the syllabus. The thing about that is that they can take the content and explain them in a way that is more accessible to the student, whether in terms of language, in terms of examples, and all that. So what we had hoped to do is to create a library of these resources for different topics, with them explaining some of the concepts, them trying out some of the questions at a pace that they believe the students would be able to follow. Because again, one of the unique challenges for the African context is that we're very oral. So we tend to do things a lot by listening and by hearing more than by reading text. So if you're just going to give a student text to read, in most cases, it will not be as welcomed until you put a voice to it. And you put a voice that they can identify with. That will use examples to illustrate the concepts in a way that is closer home to them than that. So I think over the next 1 year, this year, part of the challenge is how to create those resources. And good enough, I would say that the aspect of financial literacy is a fairly popular aspect. There's a lot of interest around financial literacy. There are schools, I was talking to a school one of the schools in Rwanda, was like, oh, we've been talking about financial literacy to our students, but we've not had an opportunity for them to showcase their understanding. So they thought the Economic Olympiad is actually a good avenue for that. So that's one example. In Kenya, on the other hand, we have corporate organizations. For example, we have an insurance company that has recently partnered with the government curriculum body and developed financial literacy resources. And they just launched the financial literacy resources just around the time we were doing the Economic Olympiads. So there's a lot of appreciation of the value for financial literacy. I think the other thing that was unique also is that around the time we were doing the Economics Olympiad, if might not have gotten to your ears, but we had this long protest in Kenya that was led by the youth, and it was about challenging the financial bill for the year. And it actually led to that financial bill not being, or rather being recalled by the president, because they were not happy about some of the provisions within that financial bill. But what happened around that time was there was a lot of effort for people to educate themselves on different aspects of the bill and and it was the young people. So I'm just saying that part of what will help push this is amplifying the financial literacy aspect of this competition. Within that, there is an opportunity to bring more potential partners in terms of corporates who could eventually invest some resources in this to support related activities like hosting of the competitions or hosting of the camps for training and all.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is what some of our partners already are doing. They invite those banks, financial organizations, central bank sometimes participates as well to promote the financial literacy, which becomes one of their main parts of the national competition. That's true. Do you invite your alumni, the students from previous year, to get on board, to be one of the organizers of the national competition, or maybe prepare?
Of course, we have only one alumni now, 1 year alumni since it was just last year. And yes, for example, I said right now we're going to have the Rwanda-Kenya competition. We have invited the national team from Kenya to be part of that. And the students who participated as from Rwanda will also be invited. We expect to have some panel conversations where they might share their experiences. Some of them are eligible to participate again because some of them, I think, were just in their second year of secondary school. So they will be eligible to compete alongside other people and see if they qualify into the national team in the coming years. So yes, their voice is going to be very important. Their observation about the different components and how that worked out, because I think for both countries we saw strengths in different areas. So for example, the Kenyan team had a challenge with the group presentation. And when you look at it, it had something to do with the Kenyan education system, because things like group presentations and putting together a presentation and working on addressing a situation, that's not a common activity in our curriculum, in the Kenyan curriculum. On the other hand, the students who were in Rwanda, because they were coming from the private schools, the curriculum that they're doing allows them to do projects, and they thrived more in the group presentation. So also, I think one of the things I need to mention is that my intention is to eventually tap into some of this data, because part of it are insights that can be built back into policy conversations with the government in terms of strengths, in terms of gaps, in terms of lessons that could be borrowed in the way, let's say, problem-based questions are shaped. There's a lot of learning that can be drawn from it. But the frustration or the limitation we had with Maths Olympiad, this comes from my lesson from Maths Olympiad, is we generate so much data, but there was no deliberate mechanism to make sense of that data, to package it into a report that could then be shared by decision makers or policy makers. And that's something that I'm really keen to build from a very early stage in our interface with economic Olympiads.
Well, thank you a lot for this interesting excursus into how it is for Kenya and Rwanda students and how it works in the educational system. Maybe to wrap up, I would like to ask you, what would you, if you were able to give an advice to yourself a year ago, before you started, or to those organizations who are, like right now, considering or starting or building their competitions? What would be your advice or advices to yourself or to them?
I think number one is start early.
Hmm.
Start early, though I didn't have the luxury of starting early. Since the competitions are in August, depending on the ecosystem, starting early is really important. And being creative, so that's one thing that I would be very keen about. Number two is just to know that it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of sacrifice. So get into it with that understanding, really, because I don't think, especially if you are starting, you can escape that. It's something you have to internalize and not take as an activity, but something that you really identify with, because it actually requires you to invest in yourself. And number three, I think that was very important is, I mean, maybe I'm not advising myself, but advising, is a relationship we built with you guys, especially Anna, was really helpful. Just the fact that we had built some, like we'd had conversations throughout the process. That was really a life-saving line, even during the competition, because sometimes there are things that dropped out, something is not working. And I think it just helped that there was that personal contact. We were not very foreign in the space, not knowing anybody. I mean, there were mechanisms like the advisors that you put in place, but I think it was just always good to know that, in addition, I could just slide into the DM of Anna and say, this is not working, or what could we do with this? I think that was really, really helpful. And having a big brother outside your space that has worked the place a little bit, like in our case, Professor Dewale is a big brother or big sister, I think is really important. But I think overall, not just from the IEO experience, Africa has a very unique landscape, especially issues to do with having to, you have to get resources and everything. So one has to be willing to be in this for the long haul and to know things might not work the way you plan them. Remember the story about how I had to get a venue within a day and be ready to go and sit in front of a vice chancellor and explain to the vice chancellor why this is very important. So you really have to own this and internalize it. And it's not just something somebody's telling you to do, because you have to convince people about what you're doing. So I think it's really important.
What was maybe the most crucial mistake that you made?
I think what almost became a mistake or a crisis situation for me is that I had quite a number of things lined up in my own calendar. So, and my team is not as big. So a number of, the field that I had not fully understood, or rather could not run with the thing in the manner that I would run. So in Rwanda, for example, I had the assurance of the schools they were on board until the last minute. Then I realized they were and with very valid reasons, very, very valid reasons. So there was that assumption that, these schools are on board. We are having teams from these schools until the very, very last minute. And I had to think the agility was really important, because I remember some time again, because one of the mistakes we did was students, at some point the students had closed, so they were doing the entry exams from home. And later I got to discover that because there was no oversight, the people who were just checking the answers online and all that. So I necessarily did not get maybe the best students, or the one that perhaps a few of them filtered through because of that. So I think that was a mistake, or that's something that has to be corrected next time, that when we're doing the preliminary results, the preliminary tests, I know IEO has a more developed system of oversight, and you can see people as they're doing the exams and everything. I would love to know how that works. I don't know whether it's an expensive venture, but for those online activities or whatever it is we do about preliminary qualifiers, we just have to put mechanisms in place to ensure there's no cheating.
Well, thank you a lot for sharing. I hope that we can have a more comfort, more personal conversation sooner rather than later. And maybe you will be able to help us to invite more of the African countries to participate in IEO as well. We'll be looking
Yes.
for it.
Yes. When I presented this to, I think I was talking about Rwanda, Kenya, and then in Rwanda, for example, there are many Ugandan teachers who come from Uganda. And so at some point, they're like, why is it only Rwanda, Kenya? Why is it not East Africa? So we have challenged ourselves that maybe when we have the competition in April, we might invite a few schools from outside Rwanda, Kenya, and that could be part of how contacts of persons who could run with the IEO agenda might be identified. Yes, definitely have contacts across the continent. I tend to be the go-to person for many people when they're trying to get into the continent. But yes, I look forward to, quote unquote, being an ambassador for the economics Olympiads in the continent.
Well, thank you. We would really appreciate it. And it might give them also some opportunities to promote their learning and their educational systems as well.
Definitely.
So thank you a lot. See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.